Sorry, we're late getting on. How are you?
Quite well, quite
Good.
well.
We ended with the minuet from the first sonata, Opus 2, Number 1 in F minor. We heard performances by Robert Riffling and Frederick Goulda. Let's have a performance now by Bruce Hungerford of the minuet. The minuet from the first of Beethoven's 32 piano sonatas, the Sonata Opus 2 Number 1, Bruce Hungerford, the artist. And again, I liked the first movement in his performance, and this also is so precise and well thought out. In a sense, we're doing violence to these sonatas because, and this has bothered me since yesterday, the organic unity of a Beethoven sonata is probably unrivaled in large structure. And in a way, this is violence when we tear apart a movement even for comparative purposes, although I think the the interest in this is has many merits, yet the sonatas are so integrated. They so need the whole thing to be heard. So this is disturbing me a little, Matt.
Well, but we redeem ourselves by playing one chosen version at the end.
We do
they finally do come together.
We
yes.
do redeem ourselves in that sense, and yet a great artist is thinking of the whole four movements. Yes?
Is that really so? Did Beethoven compose the whole things as one piece, or did he take a minuet here and there? Or?
Oh, no. Oh, this happened occasionally when, in the Waldstein, he composed an Andante in F major, and his student Czerny said, this doesn't work. And Beethoven then realized it, and he wrote the introduction to the long rondo. Mm-hmm. He understood that. But basically, the quest was for the unification of the work, be it a two-movement work, three movements, or in the four-movement grand scale. So I am just saying that it's bothering me a bit, but the chance to hear many artists doing these movements override this kind of violence. And yet it is a violent thing, because the more I hear the Hungerford, the more I realize this is a very large thinker, or Schnabel, or Arau, and his conception of everything is going to, or at least ideally, to the conception of the whole. So we will, yes, redeem ourselves with a whole performance at the end. But it should be a whole performance by every one of them. However, it would take 5 years. So I've gotten that off my chest,
okay.
And we'll continue with the minuet from Opus 2 number 1. And we have Arau. Claudio Arrau in the minuet of the first sonata by Beethoven, published in 1796, Beethoven then being 26 years old.
The fact that we went into the next movement brings up a question. When Beethoven wrote these and when he played them himself, were there pauses, long pauses between the movements, which we occasionally hear in concerts nowadays, or was it very short and played almost virtually without interruption?
It's up to the performer and how the performer feels the entrance into the next movement. That's also part of the time cycle of the work, and each performer will have. And we're seeing this to such a varied degree in these sonatas, and we will continue to. This silence between movements is a tricky business, especially in public performance. Let's hear Barenboim, and we'll hear a slower minuet. And that was Barenboim's performance of the minuet from the first Beethoven piano sonata. Amazing how slow his tempos are. Arau, who usually is a slow player, was fast compared to Barenboim. And I call him the Klemperer of the keyboard, Daniel Barenboim. Okay, we have the finale of the F minor sonata, and Gieseking will be heard. the finale of the F minor, Opus 2, number 1 of Beethoven, in the hands of the late Walter Gieseking. And that didn't quite make it for me. I think of this as a real spurt of energy and a more violent piece. It's like a miniature Appassionata, which is also in F minor. Let's hear if Schnabel gets more movement in it. Very good, Arthur Schnabel. And that was the finale of the F minor sonata, Beethoven's first piano sonata dedicated to Haydn. Haydn taught Beethoven, but it didn't work out too well.
Beethoven was physically not too attractive to judge from the various pictures that come with these albums. Was he a big man?
Beethoven was 5 foot 5.5 inches high, stocky, often didn't shave, did not wear a beard, of course, as you have seen many photographs of Beethoven. His hair, jet black, unruly. His dress was a scandal in, let's say, 1801.
In what way?
Well, everyone at parties were wearing silk stockings, powdered wigs, and Beethoven, as he'd walk in, absolutely was a new man. It was the 19th century. No such thing as Beethoven wearing buckles. Can you imagine the creator of even this first piano sonata wearing buckles on his shoes? He was slovenly, no wig, no refinements, was very proud of that. And remember, he was part of the revolutionary spirit of the day.
He was a rebel.
True child of the French Revolution, a Democrat at heart. We'll get more and more into this personality, which is the first great romantic figure of the 19th century, and he is always in the public's consciousness in one way, be it a T-shirt you'll see on the street by a hippie. Beethoven is a symbol. In fact, along with Michelangelo and Beethoven, I would say that if the human race voted, and if there were a big committee in the outer cosmos, and who would represent mankind, I think that Beethoven would get the vote. We'd send Beethoven out to say, this is the man who is the earthling who best represents our ideals, our aspirations, etc., etc.
But he led such a wretched life to judge from.
Wretched in many ways, and of course sublime. Depends upon how you look at it. There's his isolation alone after the deafness made a sublime creative force. The man was unhappy often, and we'll get into that more and more, but you were discussing his physiognomy. Czerny, we were talking about before. He was one of the best students of Beethoven, and he was taken as a boy of 10 to study with him in 1801, Beethoven then being 31 years old, and the deafness now is beginning to deteriorate fast. Anyway, this is what Czerny saw. We mounted, says Czerny, 5 or 6 stories high to Beethoven's apartment, and we were announced by a rather dirty-looking servant. In a very desolate room, with papers and articles of dress strewn in all directions. Bare walls, a few chests, hardly a chair except the rickety one standing by the piano. There was a party of 6 or 8 people. Beethoven was dressed in a jacket and trousers of long, dark goat's hair, which at once reminded me of the description of Robinson Crusoe I had just been reading. He had a shock of jet-black hair cut a la Titus, standing straight upward. A beard of several days' growth made his naturally dark face still blacker. I noticed also with a child's quick observation that he had cotton wool, which seemed to have been dipped in some yellow fluid in both ears. His hands were covered with hair, and the fingers very broad, especially at the tips. That's an interesting description there about the broad finger. Many people think that this is the kind of hand which is the best hand for piano playing. Thick and broad at the tips. Anton Rubinstein had him, and they were generally called by romantic critics velvet paws. Beethoven was a tumultuous piano player, the greatest pianist of his time in certain ways, and as an improviser, just unbelievable from all accounts. But as he became deaf, the piano playing, of course, dwindled, and it became a very sad, sad thing. Was composing so desperately, and the sound was harsh, and everything was dynamically off.
Is it true that he used to bite the piano while he was playing it just to hear?
He'd get so close, and sometimes he'd have the ear trumpet put to his ear. It was a long and sad deterioration from the age of 28 until his death at the age of 27. It got worse and worse. It was probably syphilis.
That's very interesting.
A cruel fate, because this man probably had the finest, and Beethoven himself said this in a letter, the finest ears of anyone of his time. And he was a proud man. You see, he couldn't go out and say, I am deaf, I can't hear. He was a very gregarious social being. He loved to be with people. Actually, his nature was very affectionate, became more and more misanthropic, more and more reclusive, and the deafness was something that he was so embarrassed about. How could I, this great genius of a composer? Remember, he spoke of himself like this. This is the first great ego-conscious artist. When he composed the Hammerklavier, I have composed this for 50 years after my death.
How did he get along with Haydn? He must not have at all.
He admired Haydn. My goodness, Haydn was the most celebrated living composer until his death in 1809. Haydn made possible, and Beethoven was very conscious of all the debts of the past, he made possible, along with Mozart, the maturity of classical technique, thus the large secular works of classical music, the sonata form per se, which would be the quartet and the symphony, the piano sonata, and so forth. He understood that he was living at a time where these techniques were on the verge of absolute maturity. And it's very important for any great artist to be born at the right time, and no artist in history has ever been born at a more precise time than Beethoven. 1770 to 1827. This ends, with Schubert's death a year later, this ends Viennese classicism. Haydn born in 1732, Mozart 1756, Beethoven 1770. It was perfect. Not only that, he was born at the correct moment where human ideals of liberty and individuality were now coming to the fore, being demanded. So this all ties in with the fact that this man wouldn't wear a wig. He wouldn't bow to the Empress, Maria Theresa. She had to bow to him.
The fact that they tolerated him, of course, was a product of the times. They had to because he was a necessary part of it.
Yes, but we must give credit to an aristocracy at that moment which was so supportive, so ripe for the artist to make a living from them. Remember, there was not yet, from the Industrial Revolution, a middle class who would yearn to go to concerts, would yearn to pay for an artist's living, being it as a performer or as a composer. So Beethoven, although treated his friends wretchedly, princes and archdukes, was very fortunate in them. So the Vienna he matured in was also very necessary. Now let's get to another performance of the F minor Sonata, Opus 2, number 1. This time who?
Bachhaus.
Bachhaus. That was the best one. My goodness, Bauhaus was excellent. Okay, we will return with the whole sonata in the hands of Australian-born Hungerford after these messages. The Opus 2 number 1, dedicated to Haydn. Bruce Hungerford, the pianist. Bruce Hungerford was quite wonderful in the Sonata Opus 2 number 1, Beethoven's first, and we now have 31 to go. Tomorrow we'll be dealing with comparative performances of Opus 2 number 2. Thank you very much for listening to this program.